Good evening, everyone. So, welcome to the 10th Constitution Day lecture organized by DAKSH. I'll spend a minute explaining the reason why we started this Constitution Day lecture before it became fashionable to celebrate Constitution Day, and then introduce Madhavan. So, we started the Constitution Day lecture series because we thought when we started this 10 years ago, that we need to spend some time considering the various broader issues that we face as a nation in light of the Constitution, take a step back, reflect on the progress that we have made since 1950, and identify the challenges that we need to address as a nation going forward. So over the years, we have had different speakers from a varied sector coming and talking to us. We have had lawyers, we have had political scientists, we have had people who run organizations that question the performance of the three different institutions of governance. And we have had some academics as well. So the intention is to generally look for the way forward after diagnosing a challenge that the speaker may identify. And that's the thought process with which we started the Constitution Day lectures. We didn't think we would reach the 10th anniversary, but we are here, and our lectures have been very interesting in terms of giving even all of us at DAKSH and others guidance on newer areas of research and new paths for a group of people that some of us call pracademics, so practitioners plus academics. So it's a mix of academic research and trying to implement that in practice. So that's the background to the Constitution Day lecture series. About DAKSH itself, for those of you who may not know about DAKSH was started about 15 years ago to focus on issues relating to accountability in institutions of governance from the citizen's perspective. So we have done a lot of things, most of which you'll find on our website. But over the last 5 years, we have been focusing primarily on the role of the judiciary as an institution in the governance of the nation, and also the enormous challenges primarily identified by judicial delays that our judiciary faces. So that's been our recent work. We do a lot of other things as well, but I will keep that for another day. Now, about our speaker, Madhavan is the president and co-founder of the PRS, Parliamentary Research Service. PRS and DAKSH have a very interesting symbiotic and brotherly relationship, because I met Madhavan and Madhukar, who started PRS together, pretty much around the same time that I was thinking of starting DAKSH. And in fact, it was Madhukar who introduced me to some of the other co-founders of DAKSH. And in the initial years, we did some work with PRS. DAKSH did some work with PRS in evaluating the performance of the Karnataka legislature. And the time it takes, the Karnataka legislature takes to pass bills and acts which govern all of us. So the journey that PRS has had over the last 15 to 16 years has been inspiring for all of us who aspire for change in the governance structures in this country. So I just want to say a couple of things. So Madhavan has had the ideal middle-class academic career, IIT and IIM, but then disappointing, I'm sure, many who expect what IIT and IIM graduates do, he moved into policy making. not the dream job that IIT and IIM graduates aspire to, or at least the people around IIT and IIM graduates think they should be doing. But it's something that when Madhavan and Madhukar explained, to some of us in the initial years what they were planning to do, we thought, wow, why didn't anybody else think of this earlier? Because what they do, and it's important to what he's going to talk about today, what they do is essentially help people in Parliament understand the laws that Parliament passes to govern all of us. And it'll be shocking for all of us, for many of us, to know the actual time that Parliament spends discussing legislation, which they then expect all of us to follow. The role of PRS in reforming that process has been nothing short of revolutionary. If there are many MPs who are reading legislation, reading the bills that are introduced and understanding the issues that are likely to arise from those bills in a more enlightened manner, I think we owe a lot of gratitude to PRS. I will give you one example which shows what the absence of a PRS type of institution in state legislatures has led to. So years ago, I was looking at the Karnataka legislature's functioning. And over a 5-year period, they had passed about 73 odd bills. So 73 odd bills had become acts. And between the assembly and the council, the amount of time that was spent discussing those bills was somewhere in the region of 10 hours. And these were all significant laws that impact our daily lives. So I sometimes think that why we don't have many more PRSs. And the reason is we don't have many more Madhavans and Madhukars. Right? So with that introduction, I request Madhavan to deliver today's lecture. He has chosen the topic of importance of norms and conventions in working the Constitution, and what the existence and the absence of these norms may do. So over to you, Madhavan.
Thanks, Harish, and thank you, DAKSH, for having me here. And before I start on the topic, I must say that when DAKSH called me, I was first surprised because I thought something like this should be by either a political scientist or a lawyer, and I'm neither. But then I thought it might be useful for somebody like a practitioner like me to speak some of the things that I have looked at. And when DAKSH asks me something, I can't say no, because I'm a great admirer of the work they do related to the judiciary and how to make the judiciary work better, which is a very, I would say, among all the institutions, the one that is today, in my opinion, in the most critical care stage in terms of medical parlance. I would say it's the judiciary, much more than legislatures and the executive, if you think of that. So great work there, and I'm always grateful for the work there. Personally, as Harish said, that we had in fact connected just when we were starting PRS. A friend had connected us, and every PRS report has an imprint, which I don't know whether Harish remembers or not. The disclaimer which we put at the end of the report, Harish helped us draft that. So grateful for that. So now, onto my talk. As you can see, we have titled it as The Importance of Norms and Conventions in Working the Constitution. So the gist of my argument, which I'm going to go ahead, is as follows. The constitution, the laws passed by legislatures, the rules written based on the laws by the executive, they all form a written set of code for governance in society. However, if you need to do positive social, political, economic reform, they are not sufficient, and they are not even sufficient for good outcomes. In most cases, you need a lot of unsaid norms, unsaid ways of behavior. Society finally runs on not written rules of behavior, but unsaid, unwritten norms of behavior. These norms also underlie how institutions function. And when institutions and people in institutions start ignoring these norms, then we get into trouble. So this is effectively what I'm going to talk about today. So let me take an example. The then Prime Minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, said in 2001, and I have the quote here, this was at a function at the Election Commission, and he said, I'll quote, "Not once in the past 5 decades has the outcome of a single parliamentary election been questioned. Not once during the past 13 elections has the transfer of power been anything but smooth. The same is true about the change of government in states." Now, of course, that 13 we now have 16 elections, so actually 17. So this is a norm. In a general election, various parties contest. The losing side hands over. If, let's say, the incumbent government loses, they've always handed over power peacefully. And we take that for granted in India, right? I mean, if, let us say, this prime minister or the next prime minister, whoever it is, or the one after that, loses the election, you would expect that person to step off and not call in the army or the cops and hold on to power. They might say some words like, we respect the people's mandate, and make some excuses, but they hand over. Interestingly, the one short period when we did not have a real sense of democracy, the emergency period, after that, when Indira Gandhi held the elections in 1977 and she lost, she handed over power. That is quite remarkable. And when they don't hand over power, you have trouble. Even in well-developed, matured democracies like the United States, what President Trump did questioning the election outcome led to trouble there, but their institutions were strong enough to hold off that challenge. So he actually broke the norm, but the institutions were strong enough. Now, I have an interesting map here. I don't know whether you can see the bits of green there. Okay. So these are, So these are the countries from left to right are the circled ones. Belize, Jamaica, there is that little Mauritius out there, of course India, Papua New Guinea, and 2 sets of islands, Solomon Islands and Vanuatu. Can you guess what's common among these? Can anyone guess? Okay, they were colonies. Then they got independent roughly after us, essentially post-World War II in that period. What else is common? There are many others which are British colonies, including our neighbors like Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and various others. These are the only countries that I know of, and I mean, if you want to argue, you can pick a fight with Ashutosh Vashni because I picked it up from his book. Okay, these are the only countries which became democratic after World War II in the decolonization period and have stayed democratic throughout. So it's an exception to the norm. We take it for granted. And none of the other countries today has a population of even 1 crore. So they are really small, tiny countries. So we have the norm that Prime Minister Vajpayee talked about. We have stayed, and this is something that is quite surprising. And we have managed. So to repeat, norms are important, not least because they help enforce the code. Equally, they help us navigate situations which may be difficult to codify. You can't codify everything. So I am going to be talking about this, and I am going to use the experience of legislatures to illustrate this point. Though I am talking about legislatures, this will hold true for all institutions, even for our daily behavior, right? I mean, wear a mask, be polite to people. When you're in a metro, allow the people to get out first before getting in. When you're in a plane, be seated until they tell you to get up on or get out. I mean, we are expected to follow these norms, and these norms are help us run. Now, the reason I am choosing to use legislatures to make this point is fairly simple. That's the only thing I know. That's where my work lies, and I don't have a detailed experience of other institutions. So my organization, as Harish said, PRS Legislative Research, has been working in the space of legislatures since 2005. And what we do is, broadly speaking, twofold. One is help MPs, and we are trying to increasingly do our work with MLAs. So hopefully Karnataka should maybe at some point of time do better. Understand the nuances of issues, take informed decisions on various types of bills that come before us. And one has to appreciate that it's not an easy job. I mean, just imagine you are an MP, and how many of us understand cryptocurrencies? If that bill comes up, the person has to understand and figure out and do. Okay, so, or insolvency code or things like that. So that's what we do. The second part we do is try to put out information about legislatures into public domain, and for that we observe legislatures closely. So that's the reason I'm taking this, and I'm going to take a number of examples from that. Okay. Let me start with a simple question. How often should our legislatures meet? And how often do they meet? Any idea? How many days does Parliament sit usually in a year? Anyone? Okay.
45 days.
So Parliament 60. Very good. So Parliament used to sit in the first 2 decades for about 100, Lok Sabha I'm saying, 125 to 140 days. It's come down to an average of 65 to 70. Last year was, of course, an exception. They sat for 33. Okay. Now, why is this important? Parliament has 3 extremely critical roles that define our lives as citizens. One, and just when I am using the word Parliament, I am using that as a shortcut to include state legislatures. So whenever I say Parliament, in your head, just think of Parliament and state legislatures, except for the statistics part, numbers part. So they have 3 very important roles. One is they make laws, and our lives are defined by the laws they make them, because we can't breach those laws. Even more importantly, Parliament holds the government accountable for all the work that the government does. So if the government doesn't do something or makes a policy, Parliament is expected to hold them accountable. And third, I think everyone pays taxes, whether income tax or GST when you buy anything. All that tax money is being spent by the government. It's a fairly large amount. It is Parliament's job to decide the allocation of funds to various objectives. So they have a fairly large plate of work to do, and they don't meet often enough. So that's an issue. And interestingly, if you look at other large or mature democracies, US, UK, the US Congress, the UK Parliament sits for over 150 days a year, every year. We have come down. This was a point of question in the Constituent Assembly debates. So I looked up the debates for this talk. And the draft constitution, which was initially proposed, said that the interval between 2 sittings should not be more than 6 months. which is actually adopted, and that's the only thing in the constitution. So you can't have more than 6 months between two sittings. So at least once in 6 months. There were suggestions by several members when this was being discussed to have at least 3 sessions and a maximum gap of 3 months. So you should have at least once every 3 months. But the assembly decided to retain the original formulation, and the argument was that the executive or the government which has been formed, that party has made a number of promises in the manifesto, wants to get the promises done, and therefore they have an incentive to get parliament to meet, to sanction what they want to do, make the respective laws, get the budgets done, etc. So that incentive should be enough to make the legislatures meet often enough. As I said, this was met in the initial periods, but it has gone. Now, last year, Parliament met only for 33 days. This is 2020. And the reason was COVID, we can't meet. It's tough. How many days did the UK Parliament meet in 2020? 151. Okay. They could meet. We didn't. We found some excuses. I've in fact written about it. And what did they do? They were in a worse shape than us. Our Parliament has digitized fairly early. Our Parliament, all the work that happens like submitting questions, putting in notices, getting information, it's all through the Lok Sabha portal and the Rajya Sabha portal. So when MP wants to submit a question, it has to be uploaded through the Lok Sabha portal through the password. This has been there for years now. So pre-COVID. UK didn't. UK, everything had to be by paper. But they still adapted. They put lines to MPs' houses for video conferencing. I mean, we are sitting in Bangalore. Don't we, as a country, have the IT capability to have a secure link to 790 people in this country? That's what we actually have publicly said that we can't do it because the lines may not be secure. That's what the government said. We should question that. Now, to make sure that they meet enough days, there have been several attempts to codify. Again, Karnataka is interesting. Karnataka passed a law in 2005, so it's an act of Karnataka, which said that there should be at least 4 sessions a year and a minimum of 60 sitting days. That's an act passed by Karnataka. What is it since then? Of course, they had an escape clause. They said that a committee comprising of the Minister for Parliamentary Affairs and some specified government officials, so everybody on the government side, they could recommend reduction of sitting days for if they thought you did not need to meet. Now, Karnataka, I looked up, I found data for the last 13 years. In the last 13 years, they have not sat for 60 days even once. The best was 2003 to 2005. Those 3 years they sat for more than 50 days. Other years they didn't even meet 50. In Parliament, there have been several attempts, several private member bills, which said you should meet at least 100 sitting days a year. But the problem is, let's say we codify, let's say we amend the constitution, and that's what the private member bill said, and add a clause saying Parliament shall meet at least 100 days. What happens if it doesn't? So that's the problem with codification. What's the penalty? Will you dissolve Lok Sabha? Will you have fresh elections? What are the consequences of not meeting something hard-coded and written in the constitution? So these items, issues like this, are actually better managed through unwritten agreement, norms of behavior. All parties, everybody decides that we should meet often and not just make those statements. And then it'll work, or at least say that these are norms, and if any norms are developed and if any government does not call the Parliament often enough to do that, there is a public loss of face, and that would help maintain that discipline. Now, this leads me to a place where the law is actually laid out in the constitution, and yet, let's see what happens. So Article 93 of the Constitution, it specifies that, I'll read the exact words, parts of that. The House of the People, so Lok Sabha was called the House of the People in the Constitution. It was named Lok Sabha later. The House of the People shall, as soon as may be, choose 2 members of the House to be respectively Speaker and Deputy Speaker thereof. Article 178 has similar provisions for state assemblies. So what it is that after elections, when they meet, as soon as may be, they will choose a speaker and a deputy speaker after the elections. That's written in the Constitution. Now let's see what has happened. Okay, sorry. This, by the way, is the first sitting of the Parliament every year. Is the president comes in a buggy, so I got a nice picture. I thought we should have some color instead of me just speaking and you getting bored. So that's the picture. I could not find a high resolution picture of President Kovind, so I thought I'll do best with the last president and not the current one. Okay. So the current Lok Sabha first met on 17th June 2019 after the election. They elected the speaker on 19th June 2019. So there is a pro tem speaker, which by convention is the senior most member, and that person's job is essentially to two things. One is administer the oath to every MP, so then they become an MP, and conduct the election for the speaker and then hand over. So that was done. 19th, we have the speaker. What about the post of the deputy speaker? 2019 June to now, we do not have a deputy speaker. It's written in the Constitution. Okay. They have not held it. Many states, similar behavior. Okay. UP Assembly, very interesting. All of you know that UP is going in for elections in a few months. It's almost 5 years. They recently elected a deputy speaker, 6 months ahead of the completion of the term. Okay. Maharashtra, so this is cross-party. Okay. So Maharashtra Legislative Assembly, the speaker resigned in February. They don't have a new speaker yet. Okay. The problem is parties are not, there are some long laid out norms and the parties are getting hampered by that and they don't want to concede. So the norm is the deputy speaker in parliament is usually somebody who is not from the government benches. So speaker is usually somebody who is from the government's party. So you have Mr. Om Birla, who is a BJP member, who is the speaker. So last parliament, for instance, the speaker was Sumitra Mahajan of the BJP. The deputy speaker was Tamidurai of the ADMK. Now ADMK was not, though they went in alliance in Tamil Nadu, they were not part of NDA. So they were formally not part of the government alliance. So they found somebody. Earlier, UPA time, there was somebody from, forget the name, from the Akali Dal who was the deputy speaker. Okay. So the norm is you usually have an opposition person as the deputy speaker. Now, the government doesn't really want to cede space and have an opposition member, though there are some, let me call, not particularly antagonistic parties still in parliament who are not part of that. But there are some issues, their leaders are not willing to concede, etc. So we had this interesting episode, in a way, almost a crisis. So when parliament meets, the very first day of the session, it's opened always by the speaker and in Rajya Sabha by the chairman, who is the vice president. And the closing sitting of every session also is presided over always by the speaker and the Rajya Sabha by the chairman. And they give a valedictory. In between period, someone else, sometimes a deputy speaker, there's a panel of chairperson because you can't be sitting there all day. They take turns. So this is the budget session of this year. Last day, unfortunately, Mr. Om Birla contracted COVID a few days earlier. Fortunately, a mild case, but he was in hospital and in isolation, and there's no deputy speaker. So they found a senior member, Mr. Mehtab of the BJD, and he was asked to preside. So he was on the panel of chairpersons, one of the more senior people, but he was not. The constitution says in such conditions the deputy speaker shall preside, but we don't have one. So we almost had a constitutional crisis. Okay. What happened in UP? It's simple. Incidentally, the last two assemblies, where the CMs, if you remember, were previous CM was Akhilesh Yadav and before that Mayawati, UP did not have a deputy speaker for all the 5 years. So UP is getting a deputy speaker after almost 15 years. Okay, my argument here is on violating conventions, we have a cross-party agreement. Now, speaking of positions like speaker and deputy speaker, another very important role in parliament, position in parliament, is that of the leader of the opposition. Because if you think of parliament as the key body that holds the government accountable for its actions, the most important part of that is the opposition, because the government party has an incentive to continue. Though each individual member is expected to still fulfill that role, but there are party constraints. So leader of the opposition is always considered a significant position, and protocol, the leader of the opposition is usually given the rank of a cabinet minister. An obscure rule was pulled out that you need at least 10% of the membership of the House to be called leader of the opposition, and we don't have a leader of the opposition for the last 7 years now. And this is not, and there's a nice precedent for it. This happened when Mr. Rajiv Gandhi was the Prime Minister in 1985, 84 to 89, 85 to 89. Same thing happened because he had swept the polls, he had got 400 plus seats, and there was no party with the 10% of Lok Sabha, which is over 50 seats, 54 seats or 55 seats. So there was no leader of the opposition. So we have today a Lok Sabha without a deputy speaker or a leader of the opposition, right? Now, coming to the speaker's role, it is one of the most critical ones. What's the speaker's job? The speaker is expected to be the neutral umpire between all the parties. That is the speaker's job. And for at least people of my generation who have watched Test cricket and watched the heydays of 1970s with people like Mr. Shakur Rana, whom all of us remember, who led to neutral umpires being put in Test cricket, right? So neutral umpires are important. And what is the speaker's job? To make sure that every MP is able to perform their parliamentary duties. That's the job. Now, I'll tell you a recent example from the British Parliament. This was a couple of weeks back, 2-3 weeks back. The budget was being supposed to be presented by the finance minister, Chancellor of the Exchequer as they call, a couple of days ahead of the budget. The Chancellor of the Exchequer revealed some spending plans to the media in an interview. The Speaker of the House, the next day when the House met, had said this, and I'm pulling out the quote from the proceedings of the British Parliament. So he said, and I quote, "I have repeatedly stated in the clearest possible terms that important announcements should be made by the government first in this House rather than outside it. I did so again yesterday in relation to the briefings issued to the media about the budget. I was therefore disappointed to see more stories in the media today with apparently very well briefed information about what will be in tomorrow's budget. The government do not just have to take my word for it. Their own ministerial code says, and he quotes, when Parliament is in session, the most important announcement of government policy should be made in the first instance in Parliament." We have rarely seen this by our speakers, at least in the 16 years that I have been watching Parliament closely across speakers. One exception, honorable exception, to some extent was Mr. Somnath Chatterjee in the initial period, but I have rarely seen this across others. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I'll start with what one could contend, or one could say, is the most important job of Parliament. The number one job of Parliament. It is to decide who forms the government, who is the Prime Minister of India. That is the most important job of Lok Sabha, first and most important job, right? The person who has the confidence of the majority of members of Lok Sabha is will form the government and will be the prime minister. So, and that person remains the prime minister only as long as that person retains the confidence of a majority of members of the House. Now, this particular question, whether the person has the confidence of the House, can be tested at any time. So, the Lok Sabha has certain rules. When we say that it can be tested any time, there should not be frivolous attempts at testing to disturb, let's say, every day. So the rule says that you have to give a notice to the speaker. The speaker will, because this is the most important question, because if there's a question or if the minister is going to stand up and speak, is the minister legitimate or not is being questioned. So the speaker will put the question in the House, the first thing, will say, those who want this motion to be taken forward, essentially this question should be raised. Those who are for it, please stand up at your seats. And a count will be taken. If there are 50 people, remember Lok Sabha is now 543 members, so it's about 10%. If there are 50 people who stand up, this has priority. The speaker will set a date and a time for a detailed discussion followed by a vote of no confidence. This is in the rule book of Lok Sabha. Okay. What happened in 2013 to 14, the last session of the UPA? That was a time when the Telangana agitation was on, and there was a lot of internal dissension within the Congress party, especially the Andhra people and the Telangana people, right? Remember the pepper spray incident? Okay, that was that period. The government did not, elections were due in a few months, 3-4 months. So even if the government falls, big deal, elections would be only then. But they would lose face. The government didn't want to do that. So there were people disrupting, mostly from the Congress benches, who were disrupting parliament. The speaker repeatedly every day will say, I want to ask this question, but the House is not in order. I can't count. I don't know. So that kept happening day after day after day. So speaker says the House is not in order. I can't take this question and figure out whether there are 50 people or not. Yet, in the middle of this, the bill to reorganize Andhra Pradesh, create a new state out of Andhra Pradesh was passed. So, if the House is not in order to decide whether we can do a no confidence motion because I can't count 50, but you can figure out whether there is a majority of people in the House who are in support of a bill. Well, how do you reconcile this, right? Now, of course, once this precedent was taken, precedents will be used. So, come the next government. This was 2018, the budget session. A no confidence motion was being moved. There's of course no question of the no confidence motion in the last government to actually pass. The government had comfortable numbers. But 2018 budget session, it was moved. The new speaker, again, there's some disturbance, kept on saying that we can't hold the count, but a budget of 20 lakh crore rupees was passed within that pandemonium. So you are saying that the House is in order enough to pass a 20 lakh crore budget, but not in order to do this. So again, my point is that both the major parties of these countries have been complicit in this. Now, let me take a second example. One was the no confidence motion. Other is what we know as the money bill. The speaker has another important role. And this was for a long time, a very non-controversial thing to do, and because everyone followed the norms. So, I'll just explain to people who are not lawyers here. I also learned this after PRS, so I didn't know this, what money bills are. And what's the idea behind the money bill is, so the idea goes way back to the British Parliament. The idea is that if the government has to function, government needs money. And Parliament has to sanction that money, otherwise the government can't do. And where do you get the money? Through taxes. Parliament has to sanction the taxes. So Parliament controls both the inward flow of money to the government through taxes and the outward flow, etc. And if this is stopped, the government falls. So a money bill is seen equivalent to a no confidence motion. If there is a bill regarding taxes or expenditure of the government, if that doesn't pass, the government is expected to resign because equal to a no confidence motion. And therefore, the power to make the government to resign has to reside solely with Lok Sabha. Rajya Sabha can't do that. So you devise something called a money bill and you say that these are bills on which Lok Sabha effectively as the sole say, Rajya Sabha can make only recommendations. That's what a money bill is. Okay. Therefore, a money bill should have nothing but items which relate to inflow of money to the government and outflow of money from the government. It should have nothing else, otherwise you'll pass other things using this route. And the Constitution is explicit on this. If you read the Constitution, there's no question about Article 110 is fairly clear on this. Now, who decides whether it's a money bill or not? It's the Speaker of Lok Sabha. Once Lok Sabha passes, Speaker certifies it as a money bill, sends it to Rajya Sabha. That's what happens. Now, several times it has been breached in the recent past, all in the last few years. These include bills, finance bills, which are bills which supposed to have only the taxation changes with the budget. But we have had finance bills which have amended the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act to retrospectively permit some contributions. It has been it has created another finance act, created the Monetary Policy Committee of the RBI, which decides interest rates, nothing to do with government finances. Another finance bill restructured a lot of tribunals. Then, of course, the Aadhaar bill was passed as a money bill. It is much more than just government subsidies. And these are now under challenge. There is a constitution bench of the Supreme Court which is supposed to look at it. Let's see what they do. Now, the question is, why are speakers in the UK willing to be more independent than India? And there's an easy answer. They have built certain norms and conventions. So in the UK, when somebody is elected the speaker, the person resigns from the party. The person is now speaker. Okay, why are people subservient to their party? You want to further your political career, you want to be there. Next election, you need to get a ticket from the party. Party can deny your ticket, then you are done. You also need, once you get a ticket, the party infrastructure to help you fight the election. Otherwise, you won't make it. You need the party behind you. So, speakers will be obligated to the party. UK has solved that. Speaker resigns from the party. Next election, it's called a speaker seat. No major party will put a candidate in that seat. There may be some independents who might do, but norm is no major party will put up a candidate. And next parliament, this person has the first right of refusal to remain as the speaker. So this person, once elected, is speaker forever. Continues until that person decides not to. That has been the norm. I mean, it's obviously not written down. Now, of course, norms are only as good as they are followed. One major convention has been broken in the UK recently. The convention is that when the speaker decides that I am done with it, I am resigning and I am not going to contest again, the speaker is usually given a peerage, so becomes a member of the House of Lords. John Bercow, who was the speaker for 4 terms until 2019, so since 2009, he announced his retirement in 2019, and he is the first speaker since 1761 not to be moved or given an offer of the House of Lords membership. 1761 to now. So that's what Mr. Johnson has done there. Now, the question is, can India evolve such norms? And for me, it is something we missed. Just think if somebody like the first speakers, like Mavlankar, had done it. He had resigned as soon as he was elevated. Or the second speaker, Iyengar, had resigned and said that I am going to be a speaker. Once those norms are set, it actually becomes difficult for the next speaker not to do that, because then you lose face. But we miss that. Incidentally, US had an interesting norm, thanks to George Washington, that no president shall seek a third term. That was a convention. This was broadly followed for 150 years. A couple of presidents tried to go for a third term. The party said, no way, we have this norm. It was broken by FDR. And he did a fourth. He won the third term in 1940, fourth one in 44. And once he started doing that, the US Congress decided this needs to be codified. And they passed the 22nd Amendment, which actually now says there's a two-term limit for the President of the United States. Incidentally, that picture, as you can see, is the House of Commons. And interestingly, they have 650 members and they don't have enough space. So that is a Brexit discussion. So when everyone is in for a big discussion, it looks like a Kandivali local, okay, which I have done for and suffered. So look at the way, that is the front row, the people they are sitting, it almost reminds me of the second class train in the Bombay trains. Okay, the fourth person sits, right? Now, does codifying help? Okay. Sometimes, not. Sometimes, in fact, it has perverse effects. Take the anti-defection law. I mean, people who know me know that's my pet peeve. Okay, so there were actually many legislators who were induced to quit their parties through various incentives. And they shifted parties, governments fell. There is a lot of public disgust at this. In fact, you might have heard the name Ayaram Gayaram, and that comes from a legislator in Haryana called Gaya Lal, who defected 3 times within 1 fortnight. Okay. So, in 1985, this reason was taken and the constitution was amended to add the 10th schedule, which effectively says that so parties, when there is a vote in parliament, they issue directions. That's what's called the whip. And they say you vote yes, you vote no, or you abstain. So if you act contrary to the party's direction, so if they have said yes and you either abstain or are absent or say no, any of those cases, you can lose your membership to Lok Sabha or to Rajya Sabha or whichever legislature. So you're kicked out. So you lose your membership to that place. That's what the 10th schedule in summary says. Okay. I have, of course, not gone into all the details. The expectation was that once you do this, they will follow the party and they will stop defections. But see what it has created. And I'm going to list a number of them, including very conceptual problems. Okay. My first conceptual problem is we have to understand what exactly is a member of parliament. What is the representative role of an MP? And there are broadly, from what I know, 2 broad theories of what an MP is. One goes back to Edmund Burke, and for people who are interested, just Google it. It's a 4-page document, nicely written. It's called, I think, it's a speech to the electors of Bristol given in 1776 by Edmund Burke, where he explains this. And his argument is that you have elected me. My job here is to represent the interests of England. And of course, he was representing the Parliament of England. Okay. And it is not to represent just you. And he goes on to say that it is my duty to exercise my judgment and not just follow what you tell me to do. Otherwise, I'm letting you down. And I would say, think of a doctor. When you go to a doctor, you expect the doctor to exercise his or her judgment and not say, I go and I say, give me paracetamol and the doctor gives me paracetamol. No, they're not supposed to follow my direction. Right? That was his view. A different view, which has been attributed to people including medicine, is that it's called the delegate model. It is that the representative is essentially the delegate of the people who have elected him and has to act in their interest, and therefore is essentially the mouthpiece of the constituency in the larger place. In India, we have subverted both these ideas. We have effectively converted the MP to be a delegate of the party, okay, not of the constituents and not an independent representative. Let me just give you a simple example. Let's suppose there is a bill that regulates fishing. And let's say there is an MP who believes that this is not appropriate. And also this bill adversely affects people in the constituency. But the MP belongs to the treasury benches. Its bill has been moved with the government. Government has issued a whip. Now the MP fervently thinks it's harmful for his constituency. MP thinks that there are issues with the bill, but the MP has no choice but to vote for it. I have come across one very interesting episode, which was a bill on contempt of court amendment. The bill said that it had defined what's contempt of court and actually said that truth is not necessarily a defense. Truth is a defense, but you should also not have malafide intentions and it should be in public interest, whatever you're saying. So just because it's true, it's not, unlike defamation. One of the MPs, Varkala Radhakrishnan, who was a senior MP from Kerala, this was during UPA 1 period when the left was supporting the government and he was part of that because he was a left MP. He, senior lawyer, I guess, he knew this was wrong. So he stands up and he says, "Sir, I rise to support the bill." It's a lovely speech, some 7-8 minutes, it demolishes the bill. And then he says, "Sir, therefore I support the bill," and sits down. But if there had been a vote, he would have had to vote for it, otherwise he loses his membership. So we have finished that off. Second, so this is the representative role. Second, what is the role of parliament? It's to hold the government to account. In fact, if you read in the draft constitution when it was introduced, Ambedkar explained the difference in the introduction speech between presidential form and the Westminster model. And he explained saying that in the presidential form, there is high level of stability, but there is lesser level of, he used the word responsibility, what we today call accountability. So, for example, Donald Trump, regardless of his approval ratings, could not be removed except through impeachment for proven acts of high misdemeanor or whatever they call it, or high treason, etc. Just because he no longer has the support of a majority of people is irrelevant. He is there for 4 years, or any president. Whereas in a parliamentary form, any day a no confidence motion, majority of MPs, you go. So that is a higher level, lower stability, higher level of accountability, which is enforced by parliament asking questions, parliament moving motions, parliament moving adjournment motions, and of course a big option of a no confidence motion. And Ambedkar's contention was that India needs a higher level of accountability at this stage, at the cost of stability, because they are two opposing things, and that's why we have chosen this. What we have done with the anti-defection is gone to the root of it. We have kept the Westminster model, but removed its core idea of higher responsibility, because every person has to vote whatever the government says and can't vote against the government. And by definition, whoever forms the government has a majority in the House. So we'll win every motion. Look at the UK Parliament, because we follow that. Many votes the government loses. Not a majority, obviously, but there'll be enough votes that the government loses. And why is this happening? It's, I think, because the anti-defection law. I can go another 10 minutes? Yeah. Okay. So we understand, because the anti-defection law does not understand the character of political parties. Okay. What are political parties? They are a set of people who have broad ideological agreement. So if you take Democrats in the US versus, I'm taking the US because it's clear there are two major parties, Democrats and Republicans. People who have a certain broad outlook of ideology will join Democrats, certain others with a different outlook will join Republicans. But within them, on many issues within Democrats, there will be disagreement. On many issues within Republicans, there will be disagreements. You won't agree on every single item. But by anti-defection, by putting them on every vote, you have assumed that once you are part of the party, you have agreed on every item you are all in agreement, and therefore the party votes as a block and you are not voting as an individual member. I'll take another example. There was a vote in 2011 on whether we should allow FDI in retail. Because it was moved by the Congress party, by the UPA, every one of the Congress members, 206 of them, said yes, and every one of the 116 BJP members said no. Do we really believe that all 116 BJP guys thought we should not allow FDI and retain, and all 206 Congress people said yes? No, they didn't have a choice. So what happens because of this? This removes the accountability mechanism of representative democracy. So now why is the government legitimate? The government's legitimacy is because, as we said, government is accountable to MPs. MPs in turn are accountable to us citizens. We enforce our accountability to MPs through the 5-year or shorter election cycle. We can vote out an MP every 5 years. An MP knows that, so the MP is accountable to us, and the government is in turn accountable to MPs. That's how the government is accountable to the people. Now, when the MP comes for re-election and you ask the MP, but on this thing I don't agree, why did you vote? The MP will say, well, I agree with you. I don't believe in this, but I didn't have a choice. I would have lost my seat. So you have actually cut that whole accountability mechanism. That's the third big issue. The fourth issue is it centralizes power within political parties, right? And actually, I would contend that a lot of party splintering is happening. We have so many parties because you have centralized power so much that if you have a different opinion, you have to actually get out of the party. You can't argue within the party and go up. So that is another consequence. Okay. Fifth is coalition governments. Okay. When there was a coalition government, at least the other political bosses had to be taken on board. And there have been attempts and there have been suggestions to fix what people call this as a loophole and say that coalition can be issued a whip together. Fortunately, that's not yet there. And finally, the law really doesn't work when it comes to the crunch. Okay. So the last major serious no confidence motion at the center was after the nuclear deal when left parties pulled out. 21 MPs, and this on record in parliament records, 21 MPs voted against the party whip because there was enough inducement and elections were not too far away. So they said, okay, we are getting enough inducements. We know what happened in Karnataka. We know what happened in Madhya Pradesh. We have seen what happened. I mean, we have seen state after state, Telangana, very recently Meghalaya, Goa, Uttarakhand, across the country. It really doesn't work for stability of the government. So the one thing you wanted, it doesn't work and it's perverted everything because you codified it. That's what we have done. We have converted parliament from actually being a place where you deliberate issues to a place where you obey the bosses. Now, my last point on this is we are in an exclusive club. Like I showed that map, which was a map of good people. We are in a club here. The other people in the club, for whatever I could figure out, are Bangladesh, Pakistan, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Zimbabwe. So India is the only other member. So that's the club of countries which have an anti-defection law of the type we have. Okay. Incidentally, the reason I put this up is if there is political instability and anti-defection law is coming into place, and you want to make money, invest in resorts. So that's some generic photo of a resort which I pulled out from the net. Okay. Now, every decision of the parliament is decided by a vote. We have built a convention that we first have a vote which is a voice vote. And so speaker will say those in support say aye, those against say no. Speaker will say, oh, the ayes have it, more people are saying yes. Anyone can challenge. If it's challenged, you have to have what is called a division where there's a recorded vote, and that's sort of a thing. If you have watched Lok Sabha TV, at the end of a division, that happens. The problem is we rarely do it. We have done it for less than 10% of votes in every Lok Sabha in the last 4 or 5, for which we have seen. Why is this important? Well, if I want to I live in the parliamentary constituency of New Delhi, which is my MP is Ms. Meenakshi Lekhi. She's of course now a minister, but before that she wasn't. If I ask her, why did you vote on something on this way? She's no longer accountable to me. That's the anti-defection part. But because there's no recorded voting, I don't even know how she voted. We don't know how our MPs have voted. There's no official record of that at all, unless there's a division. The UK, incidentally, so if you have watched Lok Sabha TV, when there's a division called, they have buttons in their seats and they press the buttons and then that comes up here. In the UK, they have a way more complex system because, as you saw in that UK picture, they don't have enough seats. They don't have fixed seats. They sit, I mean, it's like an unreserved compartment. You find your seat, put your tauliya and sit there. Okay. So you can't have those buttons because you don't know who voted. So they actually walk out into two lobbies. That's why you hear lobbies may be cleared, etc. They walk out into two lobbies, the eyes lobby and the nose lobby, and somebody keeps count and keeps marking. Despite that, they do recorded voting for almost every important bill. We don't, despite our this thing. Now, since I thought I'm boring you, I'll give you an interesting anecdote. I guess there are some lawyers and even others would have heard of something called habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is, many people say, the most important piece of law, right? It's like the courts can ask the government to bring somebody so that there's no illegal detention. The Habeas Corpus Act, I mean, there was a norm, there's a tradition in the UK going back to 1300 something, but the Habeas Corpus Act in the UK was passed in 1679. When it came to the House of Lords, there was a vote. House of Commons had already passed the bill. Now, each side appointed a teller. The norm in those days was, when there is a vote, people who are against it, opposing it, stay in their seats. Everyone else walks out. And then those who are supporting it walk back in. As they are walking back in, it's counted. So after they walked out, it is counted who are sitting in and their names are marked off. Actually, they were only counting that time. They were counting. And as people walk back in, they are counted. So you know how many supporting, how many opposing. Now this is what happened in the Habeas Corpus vote. And I'm reading a report, okay, who was then at the court of Charles II, Gilbert Burnet. Lord Grey and Lord Norris were named to be the tellers. Lord Norris, being a man subject to vapors, was not at all times attentive to what he was doing. So, a very fat lord coming in, Lord Grey counted him as 10, as a jest at first. But seeing Lord Norris had not observed it, he went on with this misreckoning of 10. So that it was reported that they were for the bill were in the majority, though indeed it went for the other side, and by this means the bill passed. The clerk recorded in the minutes of Lords that ayes had 57 and the nays had 55, a total of 112. But the same minutes also state that only 107 Lords, 107, had attended that sitting. The king arrived shortly thereafter and gave royal assent. So it passed by 2 votes, actually it lost by 9. So that's what happens there. Last couple of things. Ordinances. Ordinances were put in the... Okay, just so that there is a picture of some important people in the Constituent Assembly. Ordinances were put in with the idea that when government is not in session and you want an urgent law, executive can pass a law with limited period applicability. It will be there for 6 weeks after Parliament sits next. That's what it says. Okay. It was debated in the Assembly, and many people actually said that it should be further curtailed. Validity should be maximum 30 days from the issue of the ordinance. If you want, you call Parliament. In fact, to my knowledge, there are only 2 other countries who have the ordinance making of the type we have. They happen to be Pakistan and Bangladesh, and all of us inherited by this from the Government of India Act 1935. Okay. Other countries, what does UK do? They call a session of Parliament if you want an urgent one. But it was argued that there may be urgent, exigent circumstances when you need this power, so government should have it. That's how it was pushed. Okay. What happens? When you give extraordinary power, it's too much of a temptation. The first Lok Sabha was formed in 1952. 9 ordinances were issued that year. Okay. In our 70-year history, we have issued, averaged over 10 per year. We can't have 10 extraordinary situations between parliamentary sessions every year. I mean, that's difficult to believe. In fact, in 2015, interesting thing happened. Budget session, there is a break in the middle. One of the major ordinances, land acquisition amendment, was lapsing because 6 weeks from the beginning of session had happened. So Rajya Sabha was prorogued. So Rajya Sabha is no longer in session, so that the ordinance can be made. So we actually completely perverted the purpose. Okay. Now, this is clearly moving away from the norms that were expected of everyone that was there. Let me just quickly end with the story of the Finance Commission. The Constitution provides for a Finance Commission, which will be set up every 5 years. The idea is that taxes are collected by the center, many taxes, and for even if you generate income in Bangalore, let's say you're a resident of Bangalore, but your income may not come all from Bangalore, right? I mean, you may have stocks in something somewhere else. You may have house at rent in Delhi, so you are collecting all your income. So it makes sense for one authority to collect all your taxes, and that obviously is the center. Or there are customs. Customs will be collected only by the coastal states, other won't get it. So there are certain things which it makes sense for the center to collect. But this needs to be spent by states. So the Finance Commission decides the apportionment of central taxes to states. The Constitution uses the word that the Finance Commission will recommend. The word used is recommend how much money will go to whom. Interestingly, there have been 15 Finance Commission. This is the 15th Finance Commission. You can see Mr. N.K. Singh and the President handing over the Finance Commission report. Every time of the 15th Finance Commission, the recommendations have been accepted by the government fully. So this is one example where norms have worked throughout all our thing. So my contention is that for us to move forward, not just in the legislatures, but in governance everywhere, we need to establish norms, and we need to make sure that we build these norms and we hold ourselves to it. Thank you.
So we're just going to have a quick Q&A. I'm sure the audience has many questions, and there'll be a mic.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. I think that was really interesting. So my question is, the courts of law in India, a lot of laws in India, they recognize customs as a part of law. So do you think there is any merit to, having enforcement of these norms that you speak about? If there are actually deterrents that are enforced by courts to give effect to these norms that you discussed?
I don't have a very clear answer for the simple reason it depends on what. And in many cases, for example, the anti-defection was my classic example. If you codify, you get into trouble. Right? Or let's say number of days Parliament has to meet. What will you do? Let's say Parliament says 100 days, meets 33. What will the Supreme Court do? Will they dissolve Parliament? What will they do? How will you, I can't think of a deterrence mechanism. So I don't have a solution. So the only solution is that we need to start respecting these norms. As a society, all parties, we need to say that we need these norms, we need to meet more often. In many of these cases. For example, one of the areas where we have been trying to push is recording the votes of MPs, because it's very easy. All I need to do is to convince actually one, but let's say 5 or 6 MPs to form a group saying that we will ensure that all votes are recorded, because the rule says that any MP, if one MP challenges the speaker's voice vote, you have to record. So all you need is one MP every time says, well, I want a vote division. That's all you need, and the norm builds up. But somebody has to build the cat. So codification in some instances will also be problematic. And frankly, courts getting into policy and political issues we can get into deep trouble. Because political issues are about how do you manage and how do you navigate a lot of societal, divergent interest within society. Courts can't do that. That's the job of politicians, and they do a very important role there. They should figure that out. So, for example, I go back to the anti-defection. Why do people defect in India, and how often have you heard a Democrat or a Republican crossing the line? Or a Labour or a Conservative Party person crossing the line? Rarely. Because they have a norm about parties. They believe in a particular party. So parties have to develop their own norms. and get people to stay with them. That's what I would say.
Right. Any other question here, Smita?
Yeah, you gave a very good example of the perils of codification, but are the norms and conventions documented for public to be able to understand? And perhaps with public awareness, would it help in enforcement in any way? Do you think so? I mean, pardon my ignorance if there is such a documentation I'm not aware of.
That can't be right. The very idea that they're norms means they are unwritten and unsaid. So if they're documented, they no longer become just simple norms. Then they become codified. So however much you codify, you'll need more norms. Just think of normal society, right? I mean, you will not codify that you need to be polite to people. But if we want society to progress, we need to be polite to each other. You can't codify. That's my whole argument, that you may codify some, but there'll be still a lot which you can't codify. So we need to get to those.
Could there be a subtle difference between codification and real documentation?
No, how do you document? That's the problem. What do you document?
By way of maybe just narrative or
Yeah.
book or.
So it won't be authoritative. It will be somebody writing about it, which people can write.
Can we expect norms really to be followed when we have such a high percentage and an increasing percentage of parliamentarians with a criminal record? Shouldn't that be the first norm?
Yes and no. In the sense, yes, that should be a norm. I don't like that, like many other people. But people are electing them for whatever reason. There is a choice for voters in a constituency to vote against them. They are not exercising that choice. So they should actually have a norm that we won't elect them. You can codify. There is a codification that anybody who is convicted cannot contest. That is the rule. That is the law. The problem is there are people who have charges against them. So they are technically innocent because we believe in an innocent until proven guilty system. Though public belief may be that they are actually guilty, but a court has informed them that. I mean, that's the situation, right? All the people who are called criminal records actually don't have criminal records. They have criminal charges. They have not been convicted because the Representative People's Act says if you're convicted of anything which carries 2 years or more, then you're disqualified and you're disqualified for 6 years after your sentence ends. That's why, for example, Shashikala cannot contest an election because she was, because it also includes Prevention of Corruption Act. So that's the problem. So we need to, as a society, say we won't vote for them. But there are good reasons why they do. So I would suggest actually a nice book by Milan Vaishnav, which is called Why Crime Pays. It's about Indian system of why do people elect those who people fair. There's a fairly widespread belief that they have criminal antecedents, but still people vote for them. So that would be my way of thinking about it. Let people vote against them. Because elections are by and large free and fair, by and large.
Hi. This question is for Daksh, but I'll be happy if you can answer this.
So if it's
I'm
for
sorry,
Daksh,
yeah.
maybe on some other occasion, if you think it's more appropriate.
It's just quick. I understand you worked a lot on delays in Indian judicial system. So have you also worked on the unreported cases and that data, and what are the norms to deal with such cases? Is there any mechanism or process?
Absolutely. We have studied it. Happy to connect with you after this event to talk more about it.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Alok? He also came a bit late.
I came late, so as I tend to do. No, actually, this is a little bit of a response and adding something. And also, I wanted to ask one question. So, this idea of documentation, I remembered something very interesting. In the UK, there is something called the Lascelles principle, which is when the king should dissolve the parliament. And this list of 3 principles is actually not codified. It's not in a textbook. it originated from a letters to the editor by an anonymous author. The anonymous author was actually the secretary of the king, called Tommy Lascelles. For those of you who want to see this, watch The Crown. I think if you have seen The Crown, you will know it's a very, you'll know who Tommy Lascelles is. But here is an example of what the gentleman was asking of not a codification, but a documentation of something that has actually become practice. But my question was more about the role of the MP. You gave two theories, and I think there is a third theory which is emerging in India. And I just wanted your take on this. The third theory is that the role of the representative seems to be to shield the voter from the Indian state or negotiate with the Indian state on behalf of the voter. And when you think about it in that, when I'm seeing, what you just said about the role of the MP and just the point about criminal politicians you made, perhaps the role of the MP is some new third theory which is coming in India, which is that we see this representative as our defense, our protection, our agent with the Indian state. Thank you.
I agree with you that many people see them as that. Essentially, there is the Mughal king in Delhi, and the MP is your zamindar trying to get as much as he can and negotiate for you. It's essentially a feudal way of looking at things. And that doesn't go with at least what we think the Constitution of India aspires to do. Okay. So that view will fall afoul of the constitutional vision of things, but that is the way I will agree with you that it's getting practiced, unfortunately. I don't like it.
This is more of a comment. I think with the UK, they don't have a written constitution, right? So the whole idea of norms and conventions works better because everything is pretty much convention driven or common law driven. So without a written document, I think it may not be fair to compare the two democracies, as it were. So that's one comment. Second, I think in terms of norms and convention, you're also believing in the fundamental goodness of people. I mean, this whole, we have to be polite to each other. That's the right thing to do. We presume that we're all good people, want to live in a society of a certain kind. So that goes back to the comment on criminal backgrounds, right? So we have to have people who are interested in, or at least believe in the Constitution on Constitution Day, who want to become parliamentarians. If that basic good faith is not met, then how are you going to try and achieve all these other higher norms and conventions that go with the objectives of the Constitution, right? If that is not there, then all of this sort of falls away.
Yes, but then the whole idea of the Constitution falls away.
Which is why I think, the couple of comments later
Yeah,
was that we should have a written constitution.
Yeah, but even with a written constitution, if people don't follow the norms, what do we expect? The courts to put everybody in jail? Courts don't follow, what do we do? See, this is a never-ending thing, right? We have DAKSH has been documenting the way courts have been failing. So what after that? Like when the Lokpal was being proposed, my biggest conceptual problem was, well, if Lokpal does something, who? You have a super Lokpal. Then super Lokpal. Somewhere you have to say the Speaker of Lok Sabha is somebody where the buck stops and the person behaves according to the norm set up. The President of India behaves according to certain norms. If we have to elect such people there. If we don't, we are in trouble. And I think that is why we are in trouble. We can't have them written down. And back to the UK thing, well, they do have an unwritten, but they do have a written. Many of the acts of parliament are seen together as constitutional. And therefore, but even the US or Australia or Canada, many of these norms are followed, which we do. And we have followed them. For example, the chairman of the PAC, Public Accounts Committee, the chairperson, has always been an opposition member. It's not written down anywhere, but we do it. We have also breached it we have not officially breached it. For example, in West Bengal, the person elected on a BJP ticket, who has actually moved to Trinamool, but as soon as was elected on a BJP ticket, was made the PAC chairperson, so is technically an opposition member, has moved here. Anti-defection, since Andhra Pradesh, during the last government, TDP government, there were 4 ministers who were members of YSRCP who defected, but the speaker refused to hear the defection agreement, and they were made ministers by Mr. Naidu. So they were officially members of the largest opposition party and ministers at the same time. What do we do? So, back to, it's written, it's hard coded in the constitution. What do we do if people don't follow? That's the problem. So, only way forward I would say is we need to develop the good behavior. If we don't, we are in trouble. And I think we are in trouble.
I think, Mr. Madhavan, you're placing an enormous burden on all of us individuals.
Yes.
The easy way out is just pass a law and get on with it, right?
Yeah, let's pass a law that the monsoons shall come to India on the 1st of June every year. We have solved our drought issue.
I have a very small question. So, how do you build norms and convention among people, and especially our MPs?
It is through, a very good question. It is, I would say, role modeling. How do norms and conventions build among society? Your parents tell you when you're a kid, you start working in an organization. Every organization where you work in has its own norms. It's not written down what you do. So how do you learn? You see the senior people doing that, telling you. So that's how it builds. So if the senior leadership across various places start doing it, and that's how has it happened in other countries? We are not going, and I'm not saying other countries are not in trouble. So US, for instance, has been breaching its own long set norms in the last few years. And that is why the US politics is in such a mess right now. So it can get breached. They can get into trouble also.
Thank you, first of all, for the session. It was enriching. Yeah.
So here.
Hi. So thank you, I said. And after listening to you, a lot of thoughts are coming into my head. But what I wanted to ask was that first part of my question was what the other person asked before this. Do we actually see a better tomorrow with so many of our politicians sitting in parliament, being MPs, having criminal charges, and we are expecting them to do good work for us? There's something missing here. Do we actually see a better tomorrow with this equation?
Okay. I will start off by saying that I am extremely optimistic. Okay. And I'll substantiate this. Okay. So there are some people here who are some friends for many, many years. Okay. And about 4 years ago, I don't know how many of you remember, I had just after Independence Day sent around. I just got some general thought and I made a Google form about India 1950 to India today, what has happened. And I sent around to guess how India has progressed in these years. And they were economic, social, and primary and HDI parameters, etc. If you look 1950 India snapshot and 2020 India snapshot, okay, and you take other countries of reasonable size and complexity like we have, we are second only in most parameters. I'm talking about economic and HDI to China. China has been the best ever 30 years in human history. Okay, we are second only to China. We have done pretty well. Okay, for example, yesterday the NFHS data came out. Our total fertility rate in 1971 was, I think, somewhere 5.7 or close to 6. That is the number of children that a woman is expected to have during her lifetime. I'm just paraphrasing the definition. It has moved to 2.0 now. It's below 2.1, which is the replacement rate. Massive, massive progress. Okay. If you look at food grain, we are like 6 times what we produced that time. The biggest indicator, I would say, which encapsulates everything, life expectancy. It was 32 or 33 or something in 1950. It is now 68 or something like that, which goes into. So we have not done badly. And a lot of that credit, I would say, will go to the people who made the policies and the laws and various, and the budgets and got that done. And that is the state. So we have not done badly, despite people having criminal records. So there is a feature there. It will be nice to not have that. But if we have people with criminal records who pass laws such as RTI, who laws pass such as let's say right to education, at least intention was that every kid should get educated. There are enough progressive laws which have been passed by parliaments in the last few years. Even economic laws, complex issues like the insolvency bankruptcy code, which goes against all vested interests, they have managed to pass. So things happen. So let's not be despondent.
Smita?
And then go back to my first chart. We are still a democracy. Even that is a huge, huge, huge achievement.
Madhavan, my question is linked to elections below the state legislative assemblies. So when you pointed out that we have a consistent conduct of elections and handing over of power, somehow that norm, which we are proud of at Parliament and state legislature, doesn't seem to percolate down to the third tier, panchayats and urban bodies. And for example, in Bangalore, we haven't had an elected BBMP for 2 years now, right? So why do you think this is?
I don't know exactly. I don't have a very good answer. But my conjecture is multiple things. One is the MLAs don't have an interest in the lower guys becoming empowered, because then they lose their power and they decide. See, the constitution itself, I mean, the panchayats and municipalities came in after the 73rd, 74th Amendment in the early 1990s. So original constitution didn't have them other than as a directive principles concept. And I don't think it had the buy-in of the political class. It was sort of pushed through. And they have been trying to not get that done because they get less empowered. Also the public attention. If you delay a state election or a parliament election, there will be massive outcry. People of Bangalore, at least in my conversations, don't seem to particularly care about BPMP not being election. If people started caring about and telling their MLAs that if you don't hold the election, we'll kick you guys out in 2 years, they will hold elections. So it comes back to public awareness. Finally, a democracy at the final end works with public awareness being pressure put onto the representatives. And not only relying on the goodwill of the representatives being good people, right? I mean, they're never. In any country. Would that sort of partly at least answer your question? I don't know.
It does, but my thought more was like, how do you, whereas norms, since you talked about norms,
This could be codified.
because
No, this is something which can be codified actually,
holding
right?
elections for MPs and MLAs for parliamentary legislatures, not only is it a norm, but it's also codified. It's 5-year term is codified. But the conduct of elections happens. But this norm doesn't seem to go beyond or below that.
No, because there is a loophole in the constitution itself, right? This can be codified. You fix that loophole.
Hi. With the Constitution, we have a very broadly written norms in it. But then we are coming to Rajya Sabha and the Lok Sabha. It's very specific. There are rule books and business conduct rules are there. Despite this, why are we getting into the precedents?
Yeah. So what is there in the rule book?
Every conduct is there written in the rule book.
No, it is written in
Yes.
the rule book. A certain set. Everything can't be written, right? For example, the rule book says that no member shall walk into the well of the house.
Yes.
The rule book says that you shall not hold placards.
Yes.
Okay. The rule book says many of these things, and anybody who has watched Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha, even more so State Assembly, sees that happening. What does one do? In fact, I remember a conversation with one of the presiding officers a few years back. The person said, what can I do? I can't disqualify or kick out 40% of the members of all. If I throw out, which state assemblies have done, okay, then I'm throwing out the entire opposition. Then what is the legitimacy of the institution of legislature, which has, where the speaker has kicked out 30% of the people, or 40% all the oppositions out? Then all my actions from now on will be questioned because there is nobody to oppose the government in the house. Anything passed will be seen as illegitimate. So it comes back to the rule book says that you should not walk in. You should not walk in.
Yes.
If you walk in, the rule book says the speaker can throw out. But speaker has, I would say, limited power to do that if a large number of people walk in. That's what happens.
But even with uh, there is so much of predetermined ways to stall the parliamentary
That is the
proceeding.
problem.
Yeah.
And
So can the parties together decide? And I still don't understand some of the things like why would an opposition party? I have talked to people. I've been doing this for 15 years. I still don't understand why would you stall question hour, because that is the moment when you actually put the minister on the mat. Why are you allowing the minister to get away? I mean, it is like a prof cancelling the surprise test. Why would a prof do that? The student is happy. The minister is superbly happy. Do you know how much they spend on an election? And again, election laws say, I think it's now 70 lakh maximum. Okay, that's what. In fact, again, Vajpayee is on record sometime in the 70s saying in parliament when he was an opposition member that we enter this house with a lie. He said it in parliament when we sign our election accounts affidavit.
So, Madhavan, it's my pleasure to thank you on behalf of DAKSH and on behalf of all of us here. What a fantastic talk you've given us. A reminder of a Doha, Kabira Khada Bazar mein, right? Literally, there's a mela outside, but figuratively also in the world of transactions. Also on how the norms need to keep up with the times. Maybe it's also a way of us to take stock of what norms have been. While codification is not the answer, you rightly put the onus back on all of us citizens, because ultimately democracy is preserved by all of us individually, and parties are only secondary to the citizens and the individuals. Thank you, Mr. Madhavan, for this wonderful talk. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot.